Alrighty, y'all. The next section that I wanted to take a look over is how the government regulates monopolies. So it says different market structures here. What it essentially means is monopolies. What does the government do to make sure that they're producing adequate amounts of goods and at the right price levels? Now, they don't do this for all monopolies, but for the ones that are important, like Georgia Power or have essential goods or vital for infrastructure, things like that, they do regulate them pretty heavily. And it comes down to this idea of antitrust laws, which maybe you looked at in US history or maybe not. Again, if you need to pause it so you can get it down, that's fine. Don't worry about the specific quote down here or anything. But these all started back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, when you see all of these big business tycoons pop up, like the robber barons, Rockefeller or Carnegie, Fisk. And they started forming these monopolies, and the government realized that these are bad for our economy. Right? Our free market economy only works if there's competition. So these antitrust laws were designed to breaking up monopolies. And at one point they were illegal, but they exist today. The government just kind of regulates them more heavily than other types of markets. A, because they underproduce, and B, because they overcharge compared to these other markets. So for our free market to work, there needs to be some level of competition. But if we have these barriers to entry that create monopolies, that prevents that competition. And so since it's a market failure, this is where the government steps in to regulate it. And that's going to be what we're looking at with our monopoly graph in just a second. So the overall goal here is two parts, right? A, we're trying to keep prices low. And B, we're trying to make these monopolies produce the right amount, right? If we're looking at Georgia Power, left to their own devices, they would want to produce to the profit maximizing point, wherever they're going to make the most money. But that's going to be less than the socially optimal point, right? That society's going to need more and they're going to want it at a lower price. And so then what we can do about this kind of comes down to these price ceilings, maximum prices on goods. The reason we don't want to tax them more heavily is because if we add taxes onto them, it hurts one of our two goals, right? If we add these taxes onto Georgia Power, it makes it more costly for them to produce. They would produce less electricity than they would otherwise. So the go-to is usually to set these price ceilings and then to regulate them a little bit further on the quantity. So we'll look at a specific example of that in just a minute. But essentially when we're looking at monopolies, we talked about these three different points that we can find on that graph. The main one, Mr. Mac, our profit maximizing point, right? The price and the number of units that's gonna make us the most money. Left to their own devices, that's where monopolies are gonna produce. We have the socially optimal point where supply and demand meet. That marginal cost curve, of course, is our supply, right? Earlier, we called it allocative efficiency. Are people's needs being met, right? If Brunswick has a population of 10,000 families, then we would have a demand for 10,000 houses. If we can supply those 10,000 houses, we're at the socially optimal point. We're at, we're being allocatively efficient. And I've called it the break-even point here, but when we're looking at that lowest point of the average total cost, where price and demand meet average total cost, that break-even point, that's our third location on it. So we're gonna look at how when we regulate monopolies, we kind of bounce back and forth between these. So here we have a natural monopoly. Let's call it Georgia Power, right? One firm, it's a natural monopoly because one firm can produce the socially optimal quantity at the lowest cost due to economies of scale. So what that means is, if we're looking at the socially optimal point, it's where supply and demand meet. Our marginal cost curve is our supply curve. So here, the socially optimal point where supply and demand meet, this average total cost is going down, all right? Now, this natural monopoly just means that the average total cost is going down. So if they get bigger, that average total cost is going to keep decreasing. So in these situations, this is where it's beneficial to have a monopoly. Like if we're looking at Georgia Power, the government allows them to have a monopoly because if we had competition, that would actually drive up their prices. So what I mean by that is, if a competing electric company were to enter into the market, we talked about like constant and increasing cost industries. If another electric company opened up, they would be competing over the same resources, the same nuclear materials, the same coal and natural gas. If that happened, that would drive up their costs. And if that drove up their costs, that would make it more difficult or more costly for the electricity, right? If this marginal cost curve goes up, The average total cost curve goes up, they'd be making a bigger loss. They'd be producing less than they were before. We don't need to think about that part of it too much, but what we do need to look at is, all right, so we want this business to produce right here. That's where supply and demand meets. That's, let's say that we need electricity for 10 million people. They're providing electricity for 10 million people. Left to their own devices, they would produce at the profit maximizing point. Let me get all the points on here real quick. Left to their own devices, they would produce at this profit maximizing point. Mr. Mac, right? Marginal revenue meets marginal cost. We would go up to this demand curve, and that would be our price. So again, this is where their profit is going to be the largest, because if they produce beyond here, the marginal cost, this red curve, is greater than the marginal revenue, this black curve, right? So any more beyond that, and they're losing money. Any less than that, they're leaving money on the table. Then we have this fair return of this break-even point, right? Where they're not making money, they're not losing money, there's zero economic profits. Now they're still making accounting profit. The business is still getting money. So essentially, when we're looking at this monopoly, we've got 3 different points that we can produce at. We can produce wherever they're going to make the most money. We can produce at this fair return price, and we can produce at the socially optimal point. Obviously, we don't want them to produce at this profit maximizing point. And if we look at why, it's because we're going to have a shortage of electricity. All right, this is where supply and demand meet. This is the amount of electricity that we need. If we're only producing this much, we're underproducing. We get blackouts. Secondly, if we're looking at the profit maximizing price, they're going to charge way more than society wants to pay for it, right? So obviously we don't want them to produce at the profit maximizing point. This fair return price, right, their break-even point, right, we wouldn't want them to produce, and if we look back at this profit maximizing point, we've got the socially optimal point, we've got our dead weight loss, right? The area between where we should be producing and what we're actually producing. So in that case, this would be our dead weight loss. If we're looking at the break-even point, right? So let's call this $10 million, right? Here, they're making $10 million, that's our demand curve, and they're spending $10 million. We're on that average total cost curve. So in that case, there's zero economic profit. Now that's better than the profit maximizing point, but we're still underproducing. We're still producing less than what society needs. So what the government's going to do here is say, all right, Georgia Power, you want to continue having this monopoly, you need to produce at the socially optimal level right here. Now the problem is, if they do this, they're making a loss. Their revenue is less than the average total cost. So we could set this price ceiling and tell Georgia Power, hey, don't charge more than this amount of money. All right, but Georgia Power would go out of business. So what we can do then is we can subsidize Georgia Power and say, okay, if you're making a loss, we'll give you $10 million this year to where you're back to making a profit. That lowers down the average total cost. All right, cool, and now you're making money again. So essentially they're regulating them in both directions. A, they're forcing them to lower down their prices and to make more goods. We want them to produce at the socially optimal level. The problem is now Georgia Power is making a loss. So if we want them to stay in business, the government needs to subsidize them to lower down this average total cost. So it's kind of counterintuitive. They're forcing them to lower their prices and they're giving them more money at the same time. And so if we're trying to eliminate the dead weight loss, that fair return price still has some dead weight loss. They're still underproducing compared to what society wants. If we're at this socially optimal amount, then there isn't any dead weight loss. We're producing at the desirable levels. And this is just kind of explaining that. The firm would make a loss and would require a subsidy. I would pause it and write this down as well. So again, if we allow these monopolies to happen, we force them to lower their prices, we set these price ceilings on them, not all of them, but the ones that are important we do. We set, or most of them, not all of them. We set these price ceilings on it. All right, they're making a loss. We subsidize them to lower down that average total cost. And so taking a look at this practice, this was in one of the FRQs of one of the previous exams. Let's take a look at these 3 different questions. What's the profit maximizing quantity for this firm? What would be the profit maximizing price? So if we're looking at this first point, what we're going to do to find the most money, we're looking at Mr. Mac. where marginal revenue meets marginal cost, right? So in that case, that would be at point G right here. All right, so we would produce Q1, marginal revenue and marginal cost meet at Q1. That's our quantity. If we're looking at the price, we're going to go up to this demand curve, because this demand curve is telling us what's the highest we can raise our prices and still sell all of these units. So our price would be P5. Between what two prices would be the fair return or break-even point? So now we're looking at where demand and average total cost are intersecting here. So give me a second with this. All right, so that would be at point N there. So we've got our demand curve, we've got our average total cost, we'd set the price at P2. Give me 1 second, let me take a look back at this. Okay, yeah, so in this case, they'd be making a profit, so they would be different. So that would be your break-even point where it crosses average total cost. And then if we're looking at this compared to the socially optimal quantity, the socially optimal quantity and price is where supply and demand meet. This marginal cost curve is our supply, we've got our demand, and so that would be right here. So the socially optimal quantity would be Q2. The socially optimal price would be P4. All right, so if we're looking at why we wouldn't want to produce at this break-even point then, it's because we'd be overproducing electricity then, right? We would be producing more electricity than we need. And so between what two prices would this break-even point be? It would be at P2 then. I don't know why it says between them. So it would be at P2. All right, I think that was the last bit of review I wanted to do with this. Let me double check. All right, no, so the two more things. This did come up in an earlier unit, so I'm not going to hit on it too hard. If we're looking at how the government can affect production, we've got two different types of taxes here. We've got per unit taxes and we've got lump sum taxes. Let's remember that a per unit tax is going to affect marginal cost, right? If we're looking at Mr. Mac, right, we've got our marginal revenue, we've got our marginal cost. Our profit maximizing point is where they meet, right? This per unit tax will affect our marginal cost, right? So if we raise this per unit tax, then every unit we produce, the additional cost goes up and we're producing less of it. All right, the lump sum tax isn't going to affect marginal cost. It's only going to affect the fixed and the average total cost, right? So if we're looking at this graph right here. So we're going to produce at Mr. Mac, we're going to go up to this price right here, and let's say that our average total cost is higher than that, right? So if we add this lump sum tax, it doesn't change our marginal cost because the additional cost of each unit is still the same. So the average total cost will go up, the business is going to make less money, but the profit maximizing quantity isn't going to change. So kind of a simplified way of thinking about this is going to seem kind of silly, and it's silly for a reason, is if we're looking at speeding tickets, right, that would be a per unit tax. Every time you get caught speeding, you get an additional tax. All right, on the flip side, let's say that you get caught speeding once and you get a big $5,000 penalty, but that's the only time in your life that you're going to get penalized for it. I don't think it would reduce speeding. If anything, after you get taxed, it would encourage you to speed more because you've already paid that big lump sum of money. So you might as well enjoy the speeding part of it. So this per unit tax does affect productivity. If I know that I could get caught speeding on any given day, I'm more likely to slow down than if I'm just going to get caught and taxed once. All right, we looked back at this graph in Unit 3, so I'm not going to go back over it just now. All right, and again, I would take a look back at the multiple choice questions on here. They're up on our Google Classroom. It's worth looking back over and just kind of getting the practice in. But I'll pause it here and we'll do the last unit, Unit 6.5.